The night my father was sentenced, it rained. Not the kind of soft, cinematic rain that makes poets weep and lovers linger under awnings. It was a Manhattan storm with teeth. The kind that bent umbrellas backward and turned the streets into rivers of reflected neon. I stood on the courthouse steps in a suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, and I watched the doors close behind the guards who had taken Harrison Vale away in handcuffs, and I felt the floor of the world open beneath my feet. I was 22 years old. I had never been poor. I did not yet know what it meant to be. My name is Adrian Vale. People have always found it easy to look at me. Something about the pale skin, the sharp cheekbones, the dark hair that falls across my forehead in a way I have been told looks deliberate but is simply the result of genetics and indifference. My mother, God rest her, used to say that I had the face of a Renaissance painting and the temperament of a thunderstorm. She was right on both counts. But none of that, not the face, not the family name, not the penthouse on the Upper East Side, meant anything the night the judge read the verdict aloud and Vale Industries ceased to exist as anything other than a cautionary tale. The charges were spectacular in their specificity. Securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud investors. 47 counts, each one landing in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward until they swallowed everything. My father was not a saint. I knew that. Harrison Vale was a man who had built his empire on the sharp edge of ambition, who shook hands with one fist clenched behind his back, who believed that every relationship was a transaction waiting to happen. But he was not the man they described in that courtroom. He was not a criminal who had systematically robbed thousands of ordinary investors of their savings. He was ruthless, not monstrous. And there is a difference, even if the law occasionally fails to recognize it. The evidence was damning. I still don't know exactly how it was arranged so perfectly, so completely, like a puzzle assembled by someone who had been planning it for years. What I do know is that on the third day of trial, our lead attorney, the man my father had trusted with everything, the man who had been on retainer with Vale Industries for 6 years, switched sides. His name was Dominic Cross. I can still see him the way I saw him then, standing at the prosecution's table in a charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders like it had been sewn onto him, his dark eyes calm, his jaw set. He was 34 at the time, 11 years older than me, and there was something about the steadiness of him that I had always found quietly infuriating even before he destroyed my family. He moved through the world like someone who had already thought of every possible outcome and chosen the one he preferred. He turned and looked at me once during a recess, and I will never forget the expression on his face. It was not triumph. It was not guilt. It was something more complicated than either, something that looked absurdly like grief. I decided then that I hated him. Vale Industries collapsed within 72 hours of the verdict. When a name that large falls, it falls publicly, and the newspapers were merciless. The penthouse was sold. The accounts were frozen. My father was in Rikers awaiting transfer, and I was standing in an emptied apartment with a suitcase and a bank account that the attorneys had managed to protect. A small trust my mother had set up before she died, separate from the company, inaccessible to the courts. It was enough to live on. It was not enough to feel like myself. I bought a one-way ticket to London. I told myself it was strategic. I told myself I needed time, distance, perspective. I told myself I would be back. What I did not tell myself, what I refused to examine too closely in those first raw years, was that I was also running. Running from the courtroom and the photographs and the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. Running from the version of myself that had believed the world was solid ground. It took me 7 years to stop running. London made me practical. I went there with grief and came back with a plan. 7 years of building, studying, reading every document from my father's trial that I could get my hands on, cultivating connections in finance and law and the shadowy spaces between them. I studied corporate law at LSE not because I planned to practice it but because I needed to understand the language of what had been done to us. I worked for a boutique investment firm in Mayfair, learned how money moved, how reputations were constructed and dismantled. I became very good at both. And I rebuilt the Vale name, quietly, patiently, under the radar of anyone who might have recognized it. A small fund here, a successful venture there. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would draw attention. I was laying groundwork, not building a monument. I was laying the foundation for Dominic Cross's destruction. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Dominic had, in the years since my father's trial, built himself into something formidable. Cross & Associates was now one of the most respected corporate law firms in Manhattan, with offices on the 43rd floor of a glass tower in Midtown and a client roster that read like a list of the city's most powerful institutions. He had a reputation for brilliance, for discretion, for winning. He had a penthouse in Tribeca. He had written 2 books on corporate ethics, the irony of which made me feel something that took me a while to identify as almost funny. He had never married. He had no children. His life, from what I could observe, was composed almost entirely of work and the particular kind of loneliness that very driven people wear so naturally they stop noticing it. I noticed it. I catalogued it. I intended to use it. My approach was through a man named Fletcher Mays, a mid-level attorney at Cross & Associates who had been quietly desperate for a career change. I bought his silence, his cooperation, and his resignation letter. Then I applied for his position under the name Aiden Voss, a fictional person with a meticulously constructed history, credentials that would pass any background check, and a face that I was relying on to open doors. The face had never failed me before. I walked into the Cross & Associates building on a Tuesday morning in early October, 7 years after I had walked out of a courtroom in the rain, and I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt everything so tightly controlled that it registered as nothing. The lobby was all glass and pale wood, the kind of minimalist opulence that announces wealth through the deliberate absence of ornamentation. The receptionist smiled at me. I smiled back. The interview was with one of the partners, a woman named Helena Marsh who had sharp eyes and a sharper mind and who I liked immediately despite myself. She asked good questions. I gave better answers. When she asked about my long-term goals, I said I was interested in complex corporate restructuring, which was true in a way. I intended to restructure Dominic Cross's entire life. Mr. Cross will want to meet you himself, Helena said at the end. He takes a personal interest in new hires. I'm looking forward to it, I said. Before we dive into this twisted, reborn, revenge and redemption, emotional love story, if you are obsessed with reborn and revenge stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and also comment on the story, and don't forget this story is an original work of MeBL Stories, no copyrights. If you see this story in another channel, please report that channel for copyright and theft. Now let's dive in. I was not looking forward to it. I had rehearsed it so many times in my head that the actual event felt like watching a play I had already memorized, but there is no rehearsal for the precise quality of silence that fills a room when the door opens and Dominic Cross walks through it. He was 41 now. The 11 years difference between us had done different things to us. To me it had given purpose and edge. To him, it had added a gravity that had not been there before, the kind of weight that comes not from age but from consequence. He was still broad-shouldered, still moved with that same unhurried certainty that had infuriated me in the courtroom. His hair was darker than I remembered, still without gray. His jaw was still sharp. His eyes, when they found mine across the office, were still the particular shade of dark brown that I had once, as a much younger man and for reasons I had entirely suppressed, found beautiful. I did not find them beautiful now. I found them useful. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm and dry. Aiden Voss, he said. Not a question. As if he were testing the name. Mr. Cross. I met his gaze without flinching. It's an honor. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker so brief I might have imagined it. Then he smiled, polite and controlled, and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Tell me why you want to work here, he said. I sat down and I lied to his face and I was magnificent at it. The first month was reconnaissance. I settled into the role of junior associate with a discipline that surprised even me. I was good at the work. Genuinely good, which I had not anticipated enjoying as much as I did. Corporate law, when you understand the landscape, is a kind of chess played with money and language instead of pieces, and I had spent 7 years learning to play it. I caught errors in contracts that senior associates had missed. I drafted briefs with a precision that earned raised eyebrows and approving nods. Helena called me alarmingly capable, in a tone that suggested this was not entirely comfortable. Dominic Cross noticed. He began pulling me into meetings that were above my assigned level. At first I attributed this to professional recognition. He was a man who respected ability, that much was clear. But there was something else in the way he watched me sometimes, a quality of attention that felt like more than professional evaluation. I did not let myself think about what that meant. I had a plan. The plan had no room for complications. The late-night strategy meetings began in the second month. They were not unusual in themselves. When the firm was working a complex case, late nights were standard. What was unusual was that Dominic increasingly chose to conduct these sessions himself rather than delegating them to the partners, and that he increasingly arranged for it to be just the two of us. The first time it happened, I told myself it was circumstance. The second time, coincidence. The third time, sitting across from him in his office at 11:30 at night with the city spread out behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a circuit board of light, I stopped lying to myself. He was seeking out my company. It presented a tactical opportunity that I had not originally planned for but could not afford to ignore. Closeness was useful. Trust was a weapon. I leaned into it. The conversations were, against my better judgment, not unpleasant. Dominic Cross was, I was forced to acknowledge, one of the most intelligent people I had ever been in a room with. He thought the way chess grandmasters think. Multiple moves ahead, comfortable with complexity, willing to sit with ambiguity until the right answer emerged. He was also, and this was the part one had not prepared for, funny. Not performatively, not in the way of powerful men who have learned that humor disarms people. He was quietly, unexpectedly witty, in the dry, unhurried way of someone who has decided the world is absurd and has made peace with that. I did not want to find this appealing. I found it appealing. I catalogued every vulnerability I observed, every weakness, every pressure point that might prove useful when the time came. His perfectionism. The way he went still and unreachable when a case reminded him of something he didn't want to discuss. The fact that he had, as far as I could tell, no one outside of work with whom he was genuinely close. I catalogued these things. And then, alone in my apartment on the nights when I couldn't sleep, I found myself thinking about them in ways that had nothing to do with strategy. The collision happened on a Thursday. We had been working on a restructuring case for a client whose situation was genuinely complex. Assets distributed across 3 jurisdictions, a board that couldn't agree on the time of day, and a regulatory environment that had shifted halfway through our preparation. We had been at it for 4 hours. The pizza had gone cold. The coffee had been abandoned. I had my jacket off and my sleeves rolled up, and somewhere around the 3rd hour I had stopped performing competence and was simply being competent, the way you stop performing when you forget to keep your guard up. The argument started over strategy. I had a different read on a particular regulatory risk than Dominic did, and I said so with more directness than was perhaps professionally advisable. He looked at me with something that was not quite surprise. "Walk me through your reasoning," he said. I did. He countered. I countered back. The debate escalated, not into anger exactly, but into that particular intensity that happens when 2 minds hit the same problem from different angles and neither will yield easily. His voice dropped the way it always did when he was genuinely engaged, becoming quieter rather than louder, which somehow made it more forceful. I felt the familiar heat of it, the almost physical pressure of his focus. At some point, I couldn't say exactly when, we had both stood up from the conference table and were standing facing each other in the middle of the room, papers forgotten, the city glittering behind him, and the argument had run out of words. The silence that replaced it was different from ordinary silence. He was close. Close enough that I could see the slight unevenness of his breath, could see the tension in the line of his jaw. His eyes were on my face with an intensity that had nothing to do with the contract spread out behind us, and I felt it moving through me like a current. That awareness, animal and immediate, of his proximity. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" Pause. His eyes moved over my face with that quality of attention I had been trying not to name for weeks. "Less," he said. "I expected considerably less. I should have stepped back. I should have put distance between us, recalibrated, returned to strategy. I had a plan. The plan was the point. Instead I said, I could say the same of you." And the air between us pulled taut like a wire, and neither of us moved, and the city hummed below us in the dark, and I understood with a cold clarity that I was in significant trouble. It should have been a warning. I treated it like information. The plan had always included the possibility of seduction as a tool, not because I had mapped it out coldly, but because I had understood that Dominic's isolation was a vulnerability and that proximity creates leverage. What I had not mapped out was the possibility that the seduction would not feel entirely like performance. I kept working. I kept cataloging. I assembled, over the following weeks, a comprehensive picture of Cross and Associates' financial architecture. The clients, the fee structures, the dependencies. I had contacts in London who could, at the right moment, introduce doubt into the right conversations. A well-placed question to the right journalist. A document that surfaced at the wrong time. I had the mechanism. I just needed the trigger. And I kept finding reasons to delay. The late evenings continued. They became something I looked forward to in a way I refused to examine directly. We fell into a routine. The office emptied, Dominic would send a message asking if I had a few minutes, and those few minutes would stretch into hours. We talked about cases, about law, about the city. He asked about my background with a careful curiosity that never quite tipped into interrogation. I gave him Aiden Voss's history, which I had constructed carefully enough that it felt like a real person's past. The lies came easily. That was the part one should have been more troubled by. One evening, approximately 8 weeks into my tenure at the firm, he asked about my family. The question landed quietly, the way his most important questions always did. Your background check mentioned a family trust, he said. We were in his office. The sky outside was that deep blue that happens just before full dark, the last of the light pulling away from the glass. Parents are gone, I said. It was true at least in spirit. My mother was dead. My father might as well have been. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking up from the papers in front of him, I lost my father when I was 27. It doesn't get shorter. It gets different. I looked at him. He was not performing sympathy, he was simply making space. It was one of the things I had come to understand about him over these weeks. He did not offer comfort as a social gesture. When he said something personal, he meant it. Does it get better? I asked, and the question was real, and I hated myself a little for that. Some days, he said. On the other days you just carry it more efficiently. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. He looked up and found me watching him, and something in his expression shifted, softened in a way that his professional face never quite allowed. You can go home, Aiden, he said. I have you here too late. I don't mind, I said. He held my gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose you do. It was 3 days after that conversation that he kissed me. We were in the hallway outside his office, both reaching for the same file, and we came up close to each other in that accidental way that suddenly felt like the opposite of accidental, and he stopped. His hand was near mine on the cabinet handle. He looked down at me, he had a few inches on my height, and I watched something move through his expression, some internal debate that resolved itself into decision. He kissed me slowly with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. One hand came up to my jaw, tilting my face up slightly, and the kiss was soft and careful and warm, and lasted exactly long enough for me to forget completely that I was lying about my name. When he pulled back, his eyes were searching mine. Tell me if that was a mistake, he said. I thought of the plan. I thought of my father in a prison cell. I thought of the courtroom steps in the rain, and the sound of the gavel, and the particular expression on Dominic Cross's face when he looked at me across the aisle and what I had decided it meant. It wasn't, I said. What followed was not what I had planned and was also, somewhere beneath the layer of strategy that I wrapped it in, the most alive I had felt in 7 years. We were careful, the professional complications demanded it. Behind the firm's closed doors, within the particular privacy that the late evenings gave us, we existed in a space that felt separate from the rest of the world. He was not demonstrative in public, but in private he had a quality of attention that undid me slowly, like water finding its way through stone. He learned things about me that I had not intended to reveal. The way I hold tension in my shoulders. That I cannot work when it's too quiet, that I need the low ambient sound of a city to think clearly. That I am someone who argues not because I want to win but because I find the friction of genuine disagreement more interesting than easy agreement. He gave me, in return, pieces of himself that I understood were not given easily. He talked about the early years of the firm, the cases that kept him up at night. He talked about the weight of responsibility, the employees, the clients, the obligation to do the work correctly, not just effectively. He never mentioned the veil case. There were moments when I stood in his office and looked at him and felt the clean, cold certainty of what I had come here to do solidify in my chest like ice. And there were other moments, more frequent, more dangerous, when I looked at him and felt something else entirely. Something warmer and more complicated and deeply inconvenient. The night everything changed was in November, 4 months into my time at the firm. We had been in bed together, in his Tribeca apartment, which was spare and clean and lined with books, more personal than his office but still carrying the same quality of careful order. It was late. The city was quiet. He was lying beside me in the dark, one hand moving slowly through my hair, and I was lying to him with every breath I took and feeling the weight of it like a physical thing. You're thinking too loud, he said. Occupational hazard. He tilted his head to look at me. In the dark, his eyes were unreadable but his expression was open in a way he rarely let himself be during daylight hours. What are you worried about? Nothing. Aiden. His voice was gentle and exact. You can tell me. The intimacy of it was the worst part. Not the sex, though that had been its own particular undoing, the discovery that he was as careful and attentive in this as in everything, that he watched my face when he touched me with the concentration of someone studying something important. Not even the quiet hours after. It was this, the simple way he said my name and meant it as an invitation. Not my name. Aiden. A fiction. I'm fine, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there are things you're not telling me. My heart stopped. What do you mean? I don't mean that as an accusation. He shifted, propping himself up to look at me properly. I mean that I can see the walls. I've watched you for 4 months and you are extraordinarily good at being present without being completely here. Whatever it is you're carrying, he paused. You don't have to carry it alone. I stared at the ceiling and said nothing, because the only honest response I had was one that would end everything. The document that changed everything arrived in my encrypted email 3 weeks later. I had contacts still working on the original investigation into my father's case. People in London, a former SEC analyst who owed me a favor, a journalist who had been sniffing around Veil Industries for years. I had asked them all at different times to dig into anything that touched on Dominic Cross and his switch mid-trial. What the journalist found was buried. Not intentionally, it had simply been filed incorrectly in the course of the government's case documentation, accessible to anyone who knew what to look for and was patient enough to look. It was a series of correspondence between Dominic Cross and the federal prosecutor's office, beginning 8 months before my father's trial. And what it contained was not what I expected. I read it 4 times. Then I sat down on my bathroom floor and stared at the wall for a long time. Dominic had not switched sides. Or rather, he had, technically, but the reason was not what I had spent 7 years believing. The correspondence told a story that was complicated and terrible and had at its center a name I had not expected: mine. 3 months before the trial, the federal prosecutors had come to Dominic with evidence that they had buried in the final discovery documents. Evidence that pointed not just at Harrison Vale but at someone in the family structure who had been flagged as a potential co-conspirator. Someone who had attended board meetings, who had signed documents without fully understanding them, who had been positioned on paper as having knowledge of the scheme. Me, 22 years old. Signing what I had been told were routine papers. The prosecutors had given Dominic a choice: cooperate with the prosecution, turn the case against Harrison, and the co-conspirator angle disappeared. The unnamed family member walked away clean. Refuse and the indictment expanded. He had taken the deal. He had sacrificed his career, his reputation, his relationship with my father, 6 years of professional loyalty, to keep my name out of a federal indictment. He had done it quietly, without telling me, without telling my father, who had gone to his grave believing he had been betrayed. He had carried it. For 7 years he had carried it alone. And I had come here to destroy him. The floor of the world opened under me again, the way it had on the courthouse steps in the rain, but this time I was the one who had caused the crack in the foundation. I did not sleep. I paced the apartment that had become, over these months, a space full of the evidence of my duplicity, files and notes, and the infrastructure of a plan that I now couldn't look at without something close to physical revulsion. I thought about walking away. Quietly, cleanly, manufacturing a reason to resign from the firm, disappearing back into the false identity, letting Dominic Cross continue his life undisturbed by the knowledge of what I had been planning. He would never know. He would be protected. But he would also be lied to. He was already being lied to. Every conversation, every late evening, every moment of genuine closeness had been conducted under a false name, and whether or not the plan had dissolved, the lie remained. I thought about my father, still in prison for more years on his sentence. I thought about what it would mean to tell him that the man we had both hated, the man my father had called a betrayer in every letter he sent me, had actually... I couldn't finish the thought. I went to the office in the morning and did my work and said nothing. The day was ordinary. Dominic was in depositions. We passed in the hallway once and he touched my arm briefly, a small private gesture, and the weight of what I was carrying felt like it would flatten me. That evening he found me in the empty conference room, still at the table with papers I wasn't really reading. "Long day," he said. "I need to tell you something." He sat down. Not across from me, beside me, which was how he always positioned himself when the conversation was going to matter, as if he had decided long ago that distance was not useful. "Tell me," he said. So I did. I told him everything. My real name first. Watching his face as Adrian Vale landed in the air between us, watching the stillness that moved through him like a wave. I told him about London, about the plan, about the false identity and the 7 years of careful construction and the intention to dismantle his career and his reputation from the inside. I told him about the document I had found. I told him last and most quietly that I was sorry. The silence afterward was the longest I have ever sat in. He looked at the table. His hands were flat against the surface, completely still. The city moved outside the window. Everything was exactly as it had been an hour ago, except that the world was entirely different. "Adrian," he said finally. just the name. The first time it had been spoken aloud in this room by his voice, and even now, even in the wreckage of what I had just built and demolished in the same moment, the sound of it moved through me in a way I couldn't suppress. "You can say what you need to say," I said. He looked up. His eyes were dark and unreadable and full of something I could not name. "How long have you known?" he said. "About the document. About why he had switched." 3 weeks. "And you stayed." I didn't know what to do. He laughed, a short, soft, humorless sound. "That makes 2 of us," he said. He told me himself then. In his own words, filling in the gaps the document had left. "They came to me with a photograph," he said. He was looking at the window at the city. His voice was even, the way his voice was always even when he was containing something large. "You, at a board meeting 18 months before the trial. You were 20, just back from your first year at Columbia. Your father brought you in to watch, to learn. You signed something, I don't even think you knew what it was. A proxy document. But combined with some other materials they had collected, it was enough to build a narrative." He paused. "They weren't going to win with it," he said. "Probably. Maybe. But federal prosecutors don't need a winning case to ruin someone. They needed to expand the indictment, by themselves leverage, and you were—" He stopped. Started again. "You were 22 years old. And you hadn't done anything wrong." "Neither had my father," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Your father had done some things, Adrian." I felt the familiar anger rise and forced it down. "Not what they convicted him of." "No," he agreed. "Not exactly what they convicted him of. The scale was exaggerated. The intent was mischaracterized. But he was not entirely—" "I know." I did know. I had always known, in the private part of myself where honesty lived. My father was not a criminal, but he was not innocent either, and the line between the two had become the subject of a trial. "Why didn't you tell him? Why didn't you tell either of us why you were doing it?" Dominic looked at me then. The expression on his face was the one I had seen in the courtroom 7 years ago, and had spent 7 years misreading. "Because the deal required silence," he said. "If your father had known, he would have fought it. He would have rather gone to prison defending himself than accept a deal arranged behind his back, and you would have been caught in the middle. And because—" He stopped. "Because what?" "Because I knew what you thought of me," he said quietly. "I could see it that day in the courtroom. The way you looked at me. And I thought—" He shook his head slightly. "I thought it was better that you believed what you believed. That you had someone to be angry at. That it gave you somewhere to put it." I stared at him. "You let me hate you." "Yes." "For 7 years." "Yes." I couldn't find the word for what that was. It was somewhere in the landscape between noble and devastating, and it was also, underneath all of it, an act of love so quiet and so complete that looking at it directly felt like looking at the sun. "I need you to understand," he said, "that I am not telling you this to make you feel guilty. What you did, coming here, what you planned," he paused. "It's not something I can pretend didn't happen. I know. But I also need you to understand that He stopped again. He was not a man who struggled to say things. Watching him struggle was like watching a landslide in slow motion. "Dominic. I fell in love with you," he said, simply. "I don't know exactly when. Somewhere between the regulatory argument and the night you told me about the cold pizza you used to eat at Columbia at 2 in the morning. I fell in love with you, and I was fully aware that you were very likely not who you said you were, and I fell in love with you anyway, which says something about my judgment that I find concerning." The silence that followed that had a different texture than the ones before it. "You knew," I said. "You knew I was lying?" "Not specifically. I didn't know your real name. But I knew there were things you weren't telling me, and I knew the way you watched me sometimes wasn't how a junior associate watches his employer." He held my gaze. "I chose to wait." "Why?" "Because whoever you were, I wanted more time with you," he said. "Because I have spent 15 years being very careful about every decision I make, and I was tired of it. I went home that night and sat in my apartment with the files and the plans and the architecture of 7 years' worth of revenge, and I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I called the journalist, the former SEC analyst, the contacts in London. I told them the investigation was over. I called in the favors I had been prepared to leverage against Cross and Associates and instead directed them elsewhere, toward the original prosecutors, toward the buried evidence about the extent of the fraud against my father, toward the parts of the story that the trial had never told. Then I called a very good attorney, one who was not Dominic Cross and who therefore could work on my father's behalf without any conflict of interest. and I told him what I had found, and I asked him what it would take to file for an appeal based on newly discovered evidence. "It's not impossible," he said. "Make it probable," I said. Then I sat down and wrote a letter to my father. It took me 4 drafts to get through what I needed to say. I told him the truth about Dominic. I told him what had been kept from both of us and why. I told him that the man he had spent 7 years calling a traitor had in fact made himself a traitor, to his professional ethics, to his reputation, to everything he had built, rather than allow a 22-year-old to be caught in the machinery of a federal prosecution. I don't know exactly how my father responded, because the letter took 2 weeks to reach him and I was not at my apartment when the reply came. By then, things had changed considerably. Dominic called me 4 days after our conversation in the conference room. "Are you going to disappear?" he said when I answered. "No," I said. "Will you come over?" I went. His apartment at night was exactly as I had come to know it, spare and quiet, books on every surface, the city visible through the wide windows. He opened the door and looked at me for a moment without speaking, and I looked back, and we were both different people than we had been a week ago and somehow still exactly ourselves. "I've been thinking," he said, stepping back to let me in. "About what?" "About what I want." He turned to face me. "I've spent a very long time making decisions based on obligation and consequence and what was required. And I find that I have reached a point in my life where I would like to make at least one decision based entirely on what I want." His eyes were steady and direct. "I want you to stay." "You know who I am now," I said. "All of it." "Yes." "You know what I came here to do." "Yes." "And you still." "Adrian." The way he said my name now, my real name shaped by his voice carried in his mouth, was different from any other way anyone had ever said it. "I love you. That has nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with who you are. I knew who you were before I knew your name." I crossed the room and kissed him, not the careful, deliberate kiss of the hallway, not the careful navigation of the weeks that had followed, but the kiss of someone who has been keeping a secret for too long and has finally put it down. He pulled me against him with both hands and kissed me back with the focused intensity he brought to everything he cared about, and it was both entirely familiar and somehow entirely new. We stood in the middle of his apartment for a long time, holding on to each other with the particular kind of desperation that belongs to people who almost didn't find their way back. "I'm sorry," I said against his shoulder. "For all of it. For the plan and the lies and—" "You were 22 and your father went to prison and you thought you had been betrayed," he said. "I spent 7 years letting you believe something terrible because I thought it was what you needed. We have done damage to each other at a distance for a very long time. I think it's time we tried something else." "What something else?" He pulled back enough to look at me. His expression was that open, careful thing I had come to love on nights when the city was quiet and the professional armor was laid aside. "Honesty," he said. "Proximity. The actually rather alarming experience of letting someone know who you are and allowing them to stay." "That does sound alarming," I said. "Deeply," he agreed. "I've been avoiding it for 41 years. You. 29. A beat. And about 6 months of deliberate avoidance, specifically." Something happened to his expression that was very nearly a smile. He reached up and pushed the hair back from my forehead, a gesture so simple and so tender that I felt it in my chest like a struck chord. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Yes," I said. "We will." The appeal took 14 months. They were not easy months. The legal process was slow and resistant and required the excavation of evidence that had been buried for a decade. There were hearings and filings and procedural challenges, and there were nights when I sat in the attorney's office and felt the old desperation clawing at the edges of my patience. Dominic did not recuse himself from interest, though he maintained the appropriate professional distance from the case itself. He was there in the way that mattered, on the evenings when the work had been brutal, in the small ordinary ways that build a life without fanfare. He read my briefs and argued with my reasoning and bought coffee at 11 o'clock at night when the world seemed to have narrowed to a single point. He met my father's attorney twice over dinner as a private citizen, and offered analysis that proved useful. He never mentioned that he had spent 7 years being quietly called a traitor by Harrison Vale and that he was now working, obliquely, carefully as only Dominic Cross could, to help the man who had said it. On a Tuesday in late spring, the appeals court issued its ruling. Newly discovered evidence. Prosecutorial misconduct. Insufficient basis for 3 of the primary counts. Harrison Vale was released on a Friday morning, to a world that had moved on significantly from the one he had left. He was 64 years old. He walked out of the facility in upstate New York into a morning that was cold and very bright, and I was there to meet him with a car and a bad cup of gas station coffee because it was the closest one to the entrance, and I had been there since 6 in the morning because I could not stand to be anywhere else. He looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You look like your mother." "I know," I said. "You did this," he said. "All of it. I had help." He looked at Dominic, who was standing a few feet back with a particular tactfulness that had always been one of his most maddening qualities. The silence between the two of them lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone present except, apparently, the two people in it. My father said, "I owe you an apology." Dominic said, "No. You owe me nothing." "Dominic? You went to prison," Dominic said quietly. "For something you didn't do, to the extent that you didn't do it. That was the prosecutor's choice and partly the result of a justice system that is very good at eating people when it decides to. My choice was simply about what I could control. I chose to control one thing." He paused. "I'd do it again." My father looked at him for another long moment. He was not, Harrison Vale, a man given to displays of emotion. He had the same quality of control that I had inherited, the same tendency to feel things deeply and express them in measured, manageable doses. He extended his hand. Dominic shook it. That was all. It was enough. 6 months after my father's release, on a September evening when the city was doing that thing it does in early fall where the light comes in sideways and makes everything look like a painting of itself, Dominic asked me to move in with him. We were on his roof terrace. He had discovered, in the time we had been doing this, that I needed sky when I was thinking, that I could not stay entirely in enclosed spaces for long stretches without becoming restless in a way that was unpleasant for everyone involved. So he had acquired plants and chairs for the terrace, and we spent Saturday mornings up there with coffee and the newspapers and the arguments about law and ethics and the best approach to a given problem that had become, without my noticing, the furniture of my daily life. He did not ask dramatically. He looked up from his newspaper and said, "Your toothbrush has been here since March. Your books are taking over the east wall. I think we're past the point of pretending you don't live here." "I have my own apartment," I said. "You have a storage unit with a bed in it?" he said. "Move in." "That's the least romantic thing you have ever said to me." Adrian, Vale," he said, setting down the newspaper with the expression of a man who is marshalling patience as a deliberate act. "I have loved you since approximately the 3rd week of your tenure at my firm, during which time you argued with me for 40 minutes about regulatory risk and were entirely correct and insufferably aware of it. I have loved you through the revelation that you came to work for me under a false name with the explicit intention of professionally destroying me. I have loved you through a 14-month appeals process that turned both our lives inside out. I am proposing, with as much romance as I am capable of producing on a Saturday morning, that you stop paying rent on a place you don't sleep in and formally acknowledge what we have both known for some time." I put my coffee down. I looked at him. The September light was on his face and he was looking at me with that steady, patient, complete attention, and I felt the thing that I had been feeling for almost 2 years settle into something permanent. Not the sharp heat of early desire or the complicated warmth of cautious beginnings, but the deep, quiet certainty of someone who has found the place they belong. "You're very annoying," I said. "I am aware," he said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," I said. "That is a yes." He put his newspaper down and reached across the table and took my hand, and we sat in the September light with the city spreading out below us in all its beautiful, relentless, overwhelming life. And I thought about the courthouse steps in the rain and the ticket to London and the 7 years and the plan and the conference room and the letter and my father walking out into a cold bright morning, and I thought that the architecture of a life is built from stranger materials than anyone tells you when you are young, from loss and anger and miscalculation and the particular grace that occasionally arrives when you are least prepared for it and stays anyway. "What are you thinking?" Dominic said. "That you are the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me," I said. He smiled. It was the real one, the rare one, not the professional courtesy smile but the one that reached his eyes and made him look younger and less certain and entirely himself. "Good," he said. "I intend to stay that way." The city hummed below us. The light shifted. In my pocket, my phone had a message from my father, who was living in a modest apartment in the village, rebuilding with the same careful tenacity that had built him the first time, who called every Sunday morning and argued with me about the Yankees, telling me that he was coming to dinner Friday and asking if Dominic made that pasta dish again, because it was considerably better than mine. I showed Dominic the message. He read it and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been given something unexpected. "Your father likes my cooking," he said. "Don't let it go to your head," I said. He reached over and pushed my hair back from my forehead. That gesture, that simple and specific gesture that had undone me the first time and had not lost any of its effect in the repetition, and said, "Come here." And I leaned into him in the September light, in the city that had seen all of it, the fall and the fury and the long way back, and I let myself be held and I let myself be known, and I decided that this was better than anything I had planned. It was not what I had come back for. It was what I had needed. It was what we had both needed, more than the vindication or the verdict or the careful reconstruction of anything that had come before. It was this: two people, a rooftop, the city they both loved and had both been hurt by, the autumn light doing what autumn light does. The beginning of something that had no plan. The best thing finally neither of us had seen coming. There is a particular quality to Saturday mornings in Dominic's apartment. Our apartment, a designation I have still not entirely adjusted to, even after 4 months of technically living here, that I have not found language adequate enough to describe. It has something to do with the light. The south-facing windows catch the morning in a way that turns everything amber and slow, laying itself across the floorboards and the stacked books and the white linen in long, deliberate stripes. It has something to do with the quiet, not the absence of the city, because the city is never absent, but the way the sounds of it become distant and manageable at this hour, a hum rather than a demand. But mostly, if I am being truthful with myself, which I am now, as a practice, as a discipline I am learning with the same deliberate attention I once gave to law, it has everything to do with the man still asleep beside me. I have always been an early riser. It is a quality that has never served any useful purpose except to give me time alone with my own thoughts before the world intrudes. I used to spend these early hours with strategy, with planning, with the careful architecture of whatever I was building at the time. Now I spend them watching Dominic sleep, which is a change in the use of morning hours that I would have found incomprehensible 2 years ago and find now entirely natural. He sleeps on his side facing me, one arm extended in the direction I had been lying, as if even in sleep he is reaching. His face, without the composed professional expression he wears so fluently, is younger, not soft exactly because the structure of him is too angular for soft, but quieter, unguarded. The jaw that spends its daylight hours set in the posture of a man who has decided things is relaxed. The small line between his brows, the one that appears when he is working through a problem and deepens when the problem is genuinely difficult, is gone. I study him with the greedy attention I allow myself only at this hour. The sheet has fallen to his waist. The morning light moves across the line of his shoulder, the ridge of his collarbone, the broad plane of his chest. He is not a man assembled from perfect parts the way some people are beautiful. He is better than that. He has the particular beauty of someone built for function, for endurance, the kind that improves with knowing. The small scar below his left shoulder that he got from a bicycle accident at 11 years old and mentions with the weary specificity of someone who has been asked about it many times. The faint marks of old tension in the muscles of his back, the body's record of years spent carrying things. I know all of it by now. I know it with my hands, which is a different kind of knowing than what the mind does. More complete, more honest. I reach out and trace the line of his shoulder with the tips of my fingers, barely touching. His eyes open. He does not startle the way some people do, wrenched from sleep by contact. He surfaces gradually, naturally, the way everything Dominic does happens, with full awareness arriving in sequence rather than all at once. His dark eyes find mine across the pillow. He is still for a moment, taking me in, the morning version of the look he gives me in every room we share. Complete, considered attention. "You're staring," he says. His voice is rougher in the morning, lower, something I have catalogued with perhaps more enthusiasm than is entirely dignified. "I'm observing," I say. "There's a distinction. At." He glances toward the window, assessing the quality of light the way he assesses everything. 6:40 in the morning. "I find you interesting." The corner of his mouth moves. He reaches out and tucks a strand of hair back from my forehead. The gesture is so habitual now that I doubt he is aware of it, which is the part that gets me every time. Intentional affection is a gift. Automatic affection is something else entirely. "Come here," he says. I move against him and he pulls me in with both arms, rearranging us until my head is against his chest and his chin is resting on top of my head, and for a few minutes we are simply this, two people, early morning, the city doing its quiet thing outside. I can feel his heartbeat under my cheek. It is steady and slow. "What are you thinking about?" he says. His hand is moving in long, slow strokes down my back. "Nothing important," I say. Then, because we have agreed on honesty and I am learning to practice it even when it makes me feel exposed. "You. Just you." He is quiet for a moment. Then his arms tighten around me slightly, just a fraction, just enough to feel. "Good," he says. The touching begins the way it always does between us. Without announcement, without transition, one state becoming another as naturally as a tide. His hand, which has been moving in those slow strokes, changes quality, becomes attentive rather than soothing, begins to trace rather than simply move. I shift against him, tilting my head up, and he looks down at me with a focused expression that still, after all these months, does something to my composure that I cannot entirely control. He kisses me. Morning kisses are different from the others. There is no performance in them, no navigation of anything. His mouth on mine is slow and warm and entirely sure of itself, the kiss of a man who has decided exactly where he is and has no interest in being anywhere else. I feel it settle through me like something warm poured from a great height, reaching every part of me on the way down. I bring my hand up to his face, and he makes a small sound against my mouth that I have learned to read as the particular sound of his resolve relaxing. Adrian, he says. Just my name. The way he says it has become, over time, a complete vocabulary. This version, soft and low, means something specific. It means I see you. I want you. I am here. I know, I say. He rolls us so that I am beneath him, and for a moment he simply looks at me, that complete, still attention, and I hold his gaze without flinching, which is something that took time to learn. To be looked at this way, this thoroughly, without performing or deflecting. To let him see the parts of my face that are unguarded. He lowers his head and kisses my jaw, my throat, the point of my collarbone. His hands move over me with the careful deliberateness he brings to everything he values, and I feel the quality of it, the intention in it. This is not urgency. This is attention. The distinction matters enormously and is a thing he taught me without meaning to teach it. Dominic. His name in my mouth has the particular quality of arrival. Still here, he says, against my skin. Not going anywhere. His mouth moves down the line of my chest and I arch into it, hands in his hair, the morning light doing that amber thing across the both of us, and I feel entirely undone in the best possible way, taken apart gently, with care, by someone who knows exactly where all the pieces go. When he moves back up to my mouth and kisses me again, deeper now, the warmth between us has become heat, and his hands know exactly what they are doing and my hands know exactly what they are doing, and we move together with the particular fluency of people who have learned each other, not perfectly, never perfectly, but truthfully. He reaches for me, his hand closing around me, and I feel the whole length of him against my hip and breathe out slowly, deliberately, the breath of someone exercising conscious patience. You are trying to destroy me, I say. I have given up on destruction, he says, which is almost funny and entirely true. He takes his time with me. He always takes his time. It is one of the qualities that drove me to distraction in the early weeks and that I have since come to understand as a form of reverence. He touches me as though I am something worth spending time on, something worth knowing thoroughly, and the effect of that on a person who spent 7 years in the cold efficiency of a plan is not something I can describe without feeling it move through me again in the telling. When he finally positions himself and we find our way into each other, it is not dramatic. It is the opposite of dramatic. It is the sensation of something completing itself, two things that are meant to fit together arriving at the shape they were made for. I pull him closer by the back of his neck and feel the slow, sure pressure of him filling me, the particular fullness that I had not known to expect would feel so much like relief. He stills for a moment, forehead against mine, both of us breathing. His length inside me is extraordinary in its completeness. Not just sensation, though the sensation is staggering, but the knowledge of it, the absolute presence of him, the way it erases any possible distance between us and leaves only this. Two people, entirely known, entirely here. Okay, he says. Yes, I say. More than. He begins to move and I close my eyes and give myself over to it entirely, to the slow rhythm of him, to the warmth of his weight, to the particular music of his breathing changing as we build together toward something that neither of us rushes because neither of us wants it to end. He knows how to read me by now, the catches in my breath, the way my hands tighten on him when something is particularly perfect, the sounds I make that I cannot always control. He adjusts, responds, pays attention with his whole body, and I feel cared for in a way that goes so far beyond the physical it becomes something else, something that does not have a precise name. Look at me, he says quietly. I open my eyes. His face above mine is open, unguarded, entirely his, the real face, not the professional one, not the controlled one. His eyes are dark and full of something that I know now is not complicated and never was, that I simply did not have the vocabulary for when I was 22 years old and standing in the rain with a plan for my whole life that turned out to be wrong about everything important. He loves me. He has always loved me. In the courtroom and in the 7 years of distance and in every late evening in the conference room and in every argument and in every kiss and in this, most of all, in this specific and irrefutable language. I see you, I tell him. Because that is the thing that matters. That is the thing I want him to know above anything else. Something moves across his face that I think might be the closest Dominic Cross has ever come to coming undone in front of another person. Good, he says, his voice low and rough, and he kisses me and pulls me closer, and we move together until the morning comes fully through the windows and the rhythm between us builds into something that takes my entire capacity for thought and leaves in its place only the beautiful blank certainty of now, of this man, this light, this singular moment of being found. When it crests for both of us almost simultaneously, which still surprises me every time, as though the body makes its own decisions about this. His length pulsing deep inside me, my own undoing arriving in waves that pull every breath from my chest and leave me gasping his name against the side of his neck. He collapses slowly, carefully, rolling to take his weight off me but pulling me against him as he goes, and I follow, tucking against his chest, one of his hands moving slowly through my hair. We breathe. The city breathes. The light continues its slow transit across the floor. You're thinking again? He says eventually. The rumble of his voice under my ear. Occupational hazard, I say. Our oldest exchange. What are you thinking? I consider the question with the seriousness it deserves. There are a great many things I could say. I could tell him that I am thinking about my father, who called yesterday in a better mood than I have heard in 10 years, who is apparently taking a cooking class in the village on Tuesday evenings, which is the funniest thing anyone has ever told me. I could tell him that I am thinking about the firm, that Helena Marsh, who knows exactly who I am and has chosen to remain pleasantly unsurprised by this, has been making noises about partnership, which is a conversation for another morning but is sitting in the back of my mind with a quiet warmth. I could tell him about the article I read last night, the one about urban architectural preservation that I have approximately 14 opinions about. Instead I say, that I am glad I came back. He is quiet for a moment. His hand stills in my hair. To Manhattan, he says. To you, I say. Specifically and with full understanding of the distinction. His arms tighten around me. His mouth finds the top of my head. Adrian Vale, he says, quiet and sure. I have been glad of you since before you gave me reason to be. I close my eyes. Outside, Manhattan does what Manhattan does. Irreversible, magnificent, indifferent to the small and enormous things that happen inside all its lit windows. But here, in this room, in the amber Saturday light, in the arms of the man who loved me before I deserved it and waited for me to find my way back from the longest detour of my life. Here it is quiet. Here it is enough. Here, at last, after everything, it is home.